Mhm. And there we are. So welcome my YouTube channel viewers. We are on day 6 of MLK Uncut. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And we've been having a really good time analyzing this book. I'm going to take a moment here to just invite some people in. They may not be able to watch live, and that's okay. But they will see it in their notifications that they've been invited to check it out at their earliest convenience. So we will do that. Hope everybody is having a great and wonderful day. Great and wonderful day. And thank you to those who can watch live. You can also go down to the bottom corner of your screen and you'll either see a little person or a little arrow there. If you click on that, it will allow you to share the video on your page. All right, so let's begin. Heavenly Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for this day that you have made. Thank you, Father God, that you are sovereign, you are holy, you are righteous, you are awesome. And thank you, Father God, for the opportunity to share with your community, to share with believers, to share with those who want to hear and want to know how we cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. Father God, I pray that even as we read in this book, that you would help us to see patterns. Help us, Father God, give us solutions for our generation that we may serve our generation effectively in our time. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So yesterday we ended on talking about how violence is not an answer, that there is a futility of violence in the process of liberation, that the goal of liberation is not to see how many people can die in liberation, but the goal is actually to help people, to serve them, to get the needs of a community or a people group met. That is the goal. Today, MLK goes into a section that I would call shared power and white fear. Shared power and white fear. So we're going to start reading and pick up right at the end of where he is talking about power and non-violence. Power is never good unless he who has it is good. Non-violence is power, but it is the right and good use of power. Constructively, it can save the white man as well as the Negro. Racial segregation is buttressed by such irrational fears as loss of preferred economic privilege, altered social status, intermarriage, and adjustment to new situations. Now, again, look at what he's talking about here. He's talking about 4 main fears that white America has had in his day. And some of those things are still fears of today. How do I know? I'm going to tell you in just a moment. Fears of preferred economic privilege, altered social status, intermarriage, and adjustment to new situations. All right? So he's saying that people are coming against this joining together of black and white because of some of these things right here. Now, there was an article put out, I believe they put it back up after so much outrage happened that they took this article down, but I believe they put it back up. And it was of a white mother calling her new son-in-law Glenn with the dreads. And in that article, it was, just kind of an opinion piece for a Christian outlet, news outlet. In that article, she kind of detailed her having to get over the fact that Glenn was black to accept him because he was a Christian. Now, there's all kinds of issues with that, because we should be accepting people because they're human beings, not just because they're Christian, right? But anyway, the way that the article was written, you could tell she was kind of ignorant of her own ignorance, right? And I will probably post her article down here once we're done so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But it was almost like him being black was a trial. Him being black was a terrible inconvenience for the family that he was marrying into. And she was basically kind of writing this article as a, well, I'm going to have to grin and bear it type of an article to accept Glenn with the dreads as a person that's into her family. But it showed again these fears of intermarriage. Welcome, Mr. Charles. It showed again these fears of intermarriage, or these fears of the unknown. And that was just written a couple days ago. So here we are in 2016, and people still have these unwarranted fears about quote unquote intermarriage. He continues to say, through sleepless nights and haggard days, numerous white people struggle pitifully to combat these fears. By following the path of escape, some seek to ignore the questions of race relations and to close their minds to the issues involved. Here's another case in point. I was in a conversation last night about our elections. Now, in case you don't know, the popular vote does not decide the presidency. So I don't get into a whole lot of debate about whether or not Hillary or Trump is going to be our president, because the reality is, if either one of them becomes our president, it's not going to go well for our country. So we need to be preparing for what could happen with either one of them in office, okay? But I'd say my concern with Trump, beyond all of his lingo, beyond all of his lies, beyond all of his exaggerations, beyond all of his misinformation about several topics, right? My concern has been that the base of people that want to go back to the 1950s, they want a Bull Connor America. A lot of them do. And a lot of them are very bold about saying it. And a lot of them, white nationalists and white supremacists, have come out in support of him. I've spoken to some of them online. But we've also seen reports of several of them endorsing him. And so that has been a part of my concern with Mr. Trump becoming our president, is that it will unleash people who have the mentality of Bull Connor on this country in an unprecedented way than has been in the past. So nobody has really dealt with that. Nobody has, to me, has really addressed that. None of the white Christians endorsing him has addressed that part. Okay? So in my saying that, I had somebody who, rather than respond to that concern, they basically proceeded to tell me that I didn't know what I was talking about. That was silly of me to say. I'm like, are you paying attention to our society? Are you paying attention to the people who are now making themselves vigilante, shooting people from their garage, saying they're part of the neighborhood watch? Are you not paying attention? So again, have people who are ignoring questions of race relations, and they're closing their minds off to the issues involved. You cannot ignore a very real problem in this country. Maybe because you may not have been directly affected by it, but there are people who are directly affected by race relations in this country every day. Some every other day. Some at least several times a week. They are affected by the race relations in this country. And it is an insult to gaslight them and tell them that they're not imagining what they're actually experiencing. Okay? So let's look at what else he says here. Others, placing their faith in legal maneuvers, counsel massive resistance. Still others hope to drown their fears by engaging in acts of meanness and violence toward their Negro brethren. But how futile are all these remedies? Instead of eliminating fear, they instill deeper and more pathological fears. The white man, through his own efforts, through education and goodwill, through searching his conscience, and through confronting the fact of integration, must do a great deal to free himself of these paralyzing fears. But to master fear, he must also depend on the spirit the Negro generates towards him. Only through our adherence to nonviolence, which also means love in its strong and commanding sense, will the fear in the white community be mitigated. A guilt-ridden white minority fears that if the Negro attains power, he will without restraint or pity act to revenge the accumulated injustices and brutality of the years. And really, he is actually correct on that, because there is a minority group of the white community who fears that if Black people get a certain amount or a certain level of power, that they will act in revenge on accumulated injustice and brutality. Part of the solution to that is, how about we deal with the injustices and the brutality, right? Rather than heaping continued injustice and brutality, right? We should be probably trying to deal with it rather than being in fear of Black people attaining power in this country, right? Then he says, the Negro must show that the white man has nothing to fear, but the Negro is willing to forgive. Now, I can't tell you how many broadcasts I've seen of Black people forgiving injustice, forgiving violence, forgiving, oops, we made a mistake and killed another unarmed person, right? At some point, on the other side of forgiveness should be some acknowledgement that the system is broken. On the other side of forgiveness should be some acknowledgement of wrong. Not just, oops, we made a mistake, but as they're talking about now in Baltimore and in Ferguson, how can we begin to reform or overhaul a system that is broken? At some point, beyond being forgiven, you've got to deal with restitution, restorative justice, reparations. So MLK is right in saying that we have to be willing to forgive, but at the same time, on the other side of that, you've got to have people who are willing to say, I was wrong, and I'm going to stop this system. I'm going to do what I can to go into this system and overhaul it. I'm going to create programs where this is not the norm, where injustice is not the norm, where it shouldn't be, oh, you should expect this to happen because that's just how the system is. All right, going to continue reading. A mass movement exercising nonviolence and demonstrating power under discipline should convince the white community that as such a movement attains strength, its power would be used creatively and not for revenge. In a moving letter to his nephew on the 100th anniversary of the emancipation, James Baldwin wrote concerning white people, the really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years and for innumerable reasons that black men are inferior to white men. Many of them indeed know better, but as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. But these men are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means: that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. Now, that is a whole, yeah, that's a whole broadcast in and of itself. But one of the things he says here is that if white identity, break it down for you, just one point from what he said. If white identity is based on the belief in black inferiority, which if you look at some of the comments that went forth even recently about Rio and the Olympics and people's ability in the Olympics, you still see elements of this kind of thinking. So he's saying if white identity is connected to and centered around black inferiority, then to let go of that myth is for them to lose their identity. And I'm specifically talking about, I'm not talking about all white people, so let me put that caveat out there. I'm specifically talking about white people who have been indoctrinated even from the earliest ages, even through our public school system. They have been indoctrinated to believe that they are superior to everyone else, and especially to black people. So if your identity is connected, if your superiority or your self-esteem is connected to believing that everyone else around you is inferior, then to let go of that is also to let go of your identity, which forces you to some introspection to see what your identity is centered around, what your self-esteem is centered around. And a lot of people don't want to do that. It's easier to think that you are the greatest, you are the best in the world. And we can't be the best in the world, especially as a country, when we're like number 26 or 27 in education. So he's saying getting rid of these myths forces them, those who think this way, to lose their identity. And then he says something else very key. Goes back to what Martin Luther King said earlier. We have to get to a place where human beings, especially in this country, recognize the humanity of each other. That you're not master and slave, but you are brother and brother. I'll say it again. We have to get to the point in this country where it's not master and slave or master and former slave. Even though that was the previous economy of this country, the reality is some people still have that mindset. So it's not master and slave, it's brother and brother. That would help in how we address each other. I don't see you as my inferior. I see you as my brother. This was one of the main points of MLK's entire life, getting people to see the brotherhood of each other, people to see the humanity of each other. So we're going to continue with the reading here. The problem with hatred and violence is that they intensify the fears of the white majority and leave them less ashamed of their prejudice towards Negroes. In the guilt and confusion confronting our society, violence only adds to the chaos. It deepens the brutality of the oppressor and increases the bitterness of the oppressed. Violence is the antithesis of creativity and wholeness. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. My friend John Killens recently wrote in the Negro Digest, integration comes after liberation. A slave cannot integrate with his master. Powerful, 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 powerful statement. You can't integrate with someone that you see is inferior, with someone you see as beneath you or less than you, with someone you see as an animal or a thug in the streets. I'll read it again. Integration comes after liberation. A slave cannot integrate with his master. And if you're not liberated, then how can you integrate? Remember, the wealth gap disparity report that came out a couple of days ago said that even if white wealth were to stop growing today, it would take 228 years for black families to catch up to where white wealth is right now. Centuries gap. So he says, in the whole history of revolts and revolutions, integration has never been the main slogan of the revolution. The oppressed fights to free himself from his oppressor, not to integrate with him. Integration is the step after freedom, when the freedman makes up his mind as to whether he wishes to integrate with his former master. At first glance, this sounds very good. But after reflection, one has to face some inescapable facts about the Negro in American life. Again, MLK reiterates here, this is a multiracial nation where all groups are dependent on each other, whether they want to recognize it or not. In this vast interdependent nation, no racial group can retreat to an island entire of himself. The phenomena of integration and liberation cannot be as neatly divided as Killens would have it. There's no theoretical or sociological divorce between liberation and integration. In our kind of society, liberation cannot come without integration, and integration cannot come without liberation. I speak here of integration in both ethical and the political senses. On the one hand, integration is true intergroup, interpersonal living. On the other hand, it is the mutual sharing of power. The mutual sharing of power. I cannot see how the Negro will be totally liberated from the crushing weight of poor education, squalid housing, and economic strangulation until he is integrated with power into every level of American life. And as we see this, here we are, 50 years later, and you still see the effects of segregation in our nation. You still see the effects of the same things MLK was talking about in the 1960s, still in our country today. Why? Why do we still see it? Part of it has to do with the mutual sharing of power. People do not want to give up their share of power to see true liberation happen. All right. Mr. Killens' assertion might have some validity in a struggle for independence against a foreign invader, but the Negro struggle in America is quite different from and more difficult than the struggle for independence. The American Negro will be living tomorrow with the very people against whom he is struggling today. So again, he's saying you have a different dilemma in this country. Because this is a multiracial society, you can't say that you're an island to yourself. Because this is a multiracial society, and it's a society that has been built on the slave trade, you're saying in the future that I've got to learn to get along with the same people who oppressed me. And in turn, the people who oppress me have to stop treating me inhumanly and see me as an equal. And unfortunately, we still have people in this country that have a hard time even with that basic fact of equality. Okay, going to continue reading. The American Negro is not in a Congo where the Belgians will go back to Belgium after the battle is over. You can watch Tarzan if you want some more example of that. Or in an India where the British will go back to England after independence is won. In the struggle for national independence, one can talk about liberation now and integration later, but in the struggle for racial justice in a multiracial society where the oppressor and the oppressed are both at home, liberation must come through integration. Excuse me. Are we seeking power for power's sake? Or are we seeking to make the world and our nation better places to live? If we seek the latter, violence can never provide the answer. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. And so it goes. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. And here comes, in context, one of MLK's most important quotes that everybody loves to quote, but they don't quote it in context. And the context is, we have got to find a way for liberation to come and equality to come without violence. So here's his quote. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. The beauty of nonviolence is that in its own way and in its own time, it seeks to break the chain reaction of evil. With a majestic sense of spiritual power, it seeks to elevate truth, beauty, and goodness to the throne. Therefore, I will continue to follow this method because I think it is the most practically sound and morally excellent way for Blacks to achieve exactly equality and liberation without violence. In recent months, several people have said to me, violence is the new crime. Isn't there a danger that you will lose touch with the people in the ghetto and be out of step with the times if you don't change your views on nonviolence? My answer is always the same. While I am convinced that the vast majority of Blacks reject violence, even if they did not, I would not be interested in being a consensus leader of violence. I refuse to determine what is right by taking a Gallup poll of the trends of the time. I imagine that there were leaders in Germany who sincerely opposed what Hitler was doing to the Jews, but they took their poll and discovered that anti-Semitism was prevailing. In order to be in step with the times, in order to keep in touch, they yielded to one of the most ignominious evils that history has ever known. So being in step with a trend can leave you out of step with God. I'm going to say that again. Being in step with a trend can leave you out of step with God. So MLK was saying, listen, the last time somebody went with a trend, 12 million people were exterminated. Think about that for this coming election. The last time somebody went with a trend, 12 million people were exterminated. The last time the church agreed with evil, 12 million people were exterminated. Because Hitler told the German church, you know, if you basically don't say anything and get out of my way, I'll kind of leave you all alone in this process. But 12 million people were exterminated. Will we repeat history? We don't know yet. Ultimately, a genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. So MLK is like, I'm not interested in going with the crowd on this. I am here to mold consensus, not to go with the flow or not to go with a standard. All right. I said on one occasion, if every Negro in the United States turns to violence, I will choose to be that one lone voice preaching that this is the wrong way. Maybe this sounded like arrogance, but it was not intended that way. It was simply my way of saying that I would rather be a man of conviction than of conformity. Occasionally in life, one develops a conviction so precious and meaningful that he will stand on it till the end. This is what I have found in nonviolence. Welcome, those of you who are coming in live. Welcome, Olaudah. Welcome, Hannah. Thank you for joining us live. So MLK, he followed through on his word. He stood on nonviolence till the end. He did not change his direction and path concerning that. He goes on to say, one of the greatest paradoxes of the Black Power movement is that it is about not imitating the values of white society, but in advocating violence, it is imitating the worst, the most brutal, and the most uncivilized values of American life. American Negroes have not been mass murderers. Well, gee. 50 years later, we can't say that. They have not murdered children in Sunday school, nor have they hung white men on trees bearing strange fruit. They have not been hooded perpetrators of violence, lynching human beings at will and drowning them at whim. This is so very key. MLK is basically saying the worst, the most brutal, the most uncivilized parts of American life. He's basically warning you, don't become the barbarity, the barbarism that you hate. Let that sink in. So the paradox here is, don't become the evil, don't become the barbaric practices that you say you're fighting against, that you say you hate. If you hate murder, murdering of innocents, lynching, drowning people, bombing churches, then don't become the very thing that you say you hate. This is not to imply that the Negro is a saint. Unfortunately, a check of the hospitals in any Negro community on any Saturday night will make you painfully aware that there's violence within the Black community. But turning his hostility and frustration with the larger society inward, the Negro often inflicts terrible acts of violence on his own Black brother. This tragic problem must be solved, but I would not advise Negroes to solve the problem by turning their hostility outward through the murdering of whites. This would substitute one evil for another. Nonviolence provides a healthy way to deal with understandable anger. Nonviolence provides a healthy way to deal with understandable anger. I am concerned that Negroes achieve full status as citizens and as human beings here in the United States. but I am also concerned about our moral uprightness and the health of our souls. Therefore, I must oppose any attempt to gain our freedom by the methods of malice, hate, and violence that have characterized our oppressors. Hate is just as injurious to the hater as it is to the hated. Like an unchecked cancer, hate corrodes the personality and eats away its vital unity. Many of our inner conflicts are rooted in hate. This is why the psychiatrists say, love or perish. Love or perish. Love or perish. I have seen hate expressed in the countenances of too many Mississippi and Alabama sheriffs to advise the Negro to sink to this miserable level. Here's another famous quote, always taken out of context. But he's basically saying, love or perish. You're either going to learn to love or you're going to perish, because yes, hate corrodes the soul. And here's another famous quote from MLK. Hate is too great a burden to bear. So he's saying that in reference to the soul of the black man. He says all of your inner conflicts, things that you're going through, is rooted in hate. And though you have understandable anger, the reality is love or perish, because hate is too great a burden for your soul to bear. I'll say it again. Hate is too great a burden for your soul to bear. That's what he's talking about. Of course, you may say, this is not practical. Life is a matter of getting even, of hitting back, of dog eat dog. Maybe in some distant utopia, you say that idea will work, but not the cold and hard world in which we live. My only answer is that mankind has followed the so-called practical way for a long time now, and it has led to deeper confusion and chaos. Time is cluttered with the wreckage of individuals and communities that surrendered to hatred and violence. For the salvation of our nation and the salvation of mankind, we must follow another way. This does not mean that we abandon our militant efforts, for there can be a militancy in nonviolence. With every ounce of our energy, we must continue to rid our nation of the incubus of racial injustice. But we need not in the process relinquish our privilege and obligation to love. Violence has been the inseparable twin of materialism, the hallmark of its grandeur and misery. This is one thing about our modern civilization that I do not care to imitate. As we close, he says, humanity is waiting for something other than blind imitation of the past. If we want truly to advance a step further, if we want to turn over a new leaf and really set a new man afoot, we must begin to turn mankind away from the long and desolate night of violence. It may not be that the new man the world needs is, may it not be that the new man that the world needs is the nonviolent man? Longfellow said, in this world, a man must either be an anvil or a hammer. We must be hammers shaping a new society rather than anvils molded by the old. This not only will make us new men, but will give us a new kind of power. It will not be Lord Acton's image of power that tends to corrupt, or absolute power that corrupts absolutely. It will be power infused with love and justice that will change dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows and lift us from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope. A dark, desperate, confused, and sin-sick world waits for this new kind of man and this new kind of power. Yes, violence has been the inseparable twin of materialism, he says. It's freezing here. I hope it will come back. If you can still hear me and you can press either the thumbs up or the hearts, that will be helpful because I know my screen has frozen. Thank you for bearing with me, my YouTube viewers. All right. See if we can get some people back in. Thank you all for bearing with me. My video cut off as I was closing. Hopefully we'll be able to get people to come back in. All right. So as we were closing here, again, he says, we must be hammers shaping a new society rather than anvils molded by the old. This not only will make us new men, but will give us a new kind of power. It will not be Lord Acton's image of power that tends to corrupt, or absolute power that corrupts absolutely. It will be power infused with love and justice that will change dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows and lift us from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope. Good morning. Thank you. So at the end of this, at the end of today, MLK has been talking today about shared power, about the futility of violence, about the fears that white people still have today. And please go back, if you're just coming in, go back to the main teaching of today, which we cover those different things. But I'll go back to some of those fears he talked about. Loss of preferred economic privilege, altered social status, intermarriage, and adjusting to new situations. I know one of the things that has been heralded is the fact of our country becoming more and more brown. And what does that mean for white America? And because so many people are afraid of the unknown, so many people in this country are afraid of my place as this country becomes more increased with brown and black people. You have people now playing on those fears of the unknown. And so a lot of what we see even in the political realm is playing on this fear of the unknown. It's you know, am I going to be displaced? Am I going to have to share power? I don't want to share power, right? But MLK says in all of that, violence is not the answer. As he said in closing, violence has been the inseparable twin of materialism. And even though Black Americans in this country have understandable anger, especially at what's been going on, what he said is love or perish. That's a word for somebody today. Love or perish, because hate is too great a burden to bear. And he stood by what he believed in. He stood by his belief of nonviolence to the end. As he said, occasionally in life, one develops a conviction so precious and meaningful that he will stand on it until the end. And this is what I have found in nonviolence. Well, we're done for this week. We will be back next week. We are about 35% done with this reading, but I encourage you to get your own copy so that you can read along with us and do your own studies. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community is what we are reading. This was the last book written by Martin Luther King before he was assassinated, and he did lay out some instructions. He laid out some blueprints. He covered what were the problems and what were some possible solutions. We are going to get to the solutions, but we are walking through this book and taking our time looking at some of the problems that were present during his day and now in our own day. Monday, we're going to pick back up with this subject. He goes back into racism and white backlash. Racism and white backlash. So we'll be back on that subject on Monday. Again, thank you for watching live. Thank you for your time today. And I hope that you have a great and wonderful weekend. I will be back tomorrow morning with a different kind of live video, but I'll be YouTube streaming that. You can check my page to see what that is. And if you'd like to, again, follow any of the previous teachings from Facebook Live, you can type in the hashtag chaos or community and it will take you to the previous teachings, or you can type in the hashtag why we can't wait and it will take you to the teachings that we did on MLK's book, Why We Can't Wait. All right, take care and God bless. All right, thank you all for being patient with that little bit of technical difficulty. And again, I'll be back here tomorrow and we will be doing a session for those who want health tips on skincare and hair care. So that will be tomorrow. Take care and God bless.